Hello comrades, it's the Finnish Bolshevik. Let's do another episode on political economy, shall we? Let's talk about nominal and real wages. In the early stages of capitalism's development, payment of wages in kind was widespread, so this means that the worker doesn't receive money, he receives products such as food, some kind of housing, and only a little bit of money on top. To some extent, that still happened even in the industrial machine period of capitalism. To a small extent, it still exists today. There's also the phenomena of company towns, which basically means that the whole settlement is owned by the capitalist corporation. So the worker, even though he does earn money, the workplace, the company he works for, it also owns the hostel where he sleeps, the cafeteria or the grocery store where he gets his food, and the prices might be set artificially high. So even though he does earn money, he's forced to give the money back to the company to receive the necessary commodities. So, he might as well just be receiving the commodities directly. And that's just another way of squeezing the worker. But money wages are the typical way that capitalists operate. Money wages are characteristic of the developed form of capitalist production. And when it comes to money wages, we then have to separate and distinguish nominal and real wages from one another. So nominal wages, that's just the number on the piece of paper or the number on your bank account. So they can pay you 1,000 reals or 1,000 euros or $2,000 or $10,000, whatever the number might be. But the number doesn't really tell you all that much if you don't know what the prices of things are. So real wage means what you can actually buy with the money. Let's say the wage stays the same, but the price of all the goods doubles. Well, that means that your real wages half now, because you can only buy half the stuff you used to in the past with the same amount of money. If prices go up by 100% and nominal wages go up by 50%, it means that your real wage has fallen, even though the nominal wage has actually increased. Real wages are wages expressed in terms of the worker's actual means of subsistence. They show how many and what kinds of consumer goods and services a worker can actually buy with his money wages. And to determine a worker's real wage, we must first look at his nominal wage, then we have to look at all the prices of goods, the level of rent. Capitalists, they calculate real wages they take a basket of basic commodities, but you also have to take into consideration taxes, you have to take into consideration the fact that some days the worker might receive no wages owing to short working time, the fact that there are also a number of unemployed or partially unemployed members of the working class who other members of the working class have to support, for example, unemployed family members, etc. And you also have to take into account the degree of intensity of labor and the length of the working day. When the capitalist statisticians calculate average levels of wages, they include into the calculation the incomes of also the upper administrative groups of all kinds of managers and bureaucrats, and they also try to leave out poorly paid, unskilled labor, the wages of seasonal workers, etc., etc. And of course they ignore the huge army of unemployed and partially unemployed workers and resort to other methods of falsification so as to embellish the situation of the working class under capitalism. However, even these distorted and falsified statistics cannot completely hide the fact that the workers' standard of living is going down. The textbook, it gives the following examples. It says that in 1938, some American capitalist statisticians and economists, they used very modest standards of what a livable wage would be, and they still came to the conclusion that the average worker in America earns considerably less than half of what they consider a livable wage. And if the unemployed were taken into calculation, then the average worker earned only a third of what they considered was the minimum for survival. And in 1937, in the UK, some capitalist economists tried to do a similar kind of study, and they discovered that 80% of workers in the coal industry, 75% of workers in the extractive industries other than coal mining, and 60% of municipal workers in Britain were being paid less than the subsistence minimum. And even though those are only examples from history, they are just to illustrate a point. My intent was not to make kind of an exhaustive empirical study of modern day empirical reality. The theory still holds good, even though the situation has somewhat changed, at least in Western countries, but I was still a bit curious, so I tried to look this up quickly. So I found a bunch of sources saying that, for example, there's this headline that says that more than 40% of full-time US employees aren't making a living wage. And there's also these news headlines from Finland that I saw. This one says that if there was a 10% wage increase in Finland now, then it would mean that our wages would return to where they were in 2021. But I seriously doubt that we're gonna get a 10% wage increase. And there was another article saying that the Finnish living standard actually hasn't increased at all in 17 years. So ever since the 2008-2007 financial collapse. Okay, then let's look at the decline of real wages under capitalism. On the basis of his analysis of the capitalist mode of production, Marx establishes the following fundamental law relating to wages. He writes in Wages, Price and Profit, quote, "The general tendency of capitalist production is not to raise, but to sink the average standard of wages," unquote. Now, why is that? It is for the following reasons. So, wages, they are the price of labor power. Just like the price of any other commodity, they are determined by the law of value. So how much value is contained in labor power? How many commodities does it take to maintain a worker's labor power, to maintain him in working order? That's the basic value of labor power. But they also vary based on supply and demand, so that if there's too much supply, the price of labor power goes below its value, and if there's too little, then it can go above its value. Because of supply and demand, the price hovers approximately around the value, but it's never actually identical because the supply and demand never perfectly match. But if you take a long enough time scale, then the fluctuation can be eliminated. So theoretically, the price can be above or below the value based on supply and demand, but unlike most other commodities, the price of labor power as a rule tends to fall below its value and not go above the value. Well, why is that? Well, that's because of unemployment. There can be some short-term instances when there's a shortage of labor in some specific sector, some specific kind of skilled labor can be scarce, but more often than not, there tends to be an abundance of workers. There are several things which contribute to this. So, I mean, the textbook doesn't even talk about it, but these days there's of course the capitalists, they like to move production to cheaper countries, and they also like to bring in cheaper migrant labor to increase the amount of unemployed people, which lowers the wages. The capitalists, they can also implement more machines, and machines, of course, with automation you can completely eliminate a bunch of the workers, but even when they don't do that, they can use machines to de-skill labor. So if in the past it required a relatively highly paid skilled professional, if you introduce some kind of machine that's easy to use, it means you can replace the skilled professional with low skilled labor. That's why the capitalists, like in the Industrial Revolution, they were able to replace the strong muscular men with women and children, because the machines now did the work. Well, in that instance, it wasn't really about skill, it was about the muscular force, but it also works in relation to skill. You know, all the handicrafts people who honed their craft for a decade as apprentices, they were all replaced by machines, operated by children. These days, of course, in the West at least, child labor is mostly prohibited, but the reason that capitalists were able to use child labor initially, and still of course do widely use child labor in third world countries, which actually do account for the majority of the globe. Asia and Africa and South America are where most people in the world live, even though Eurocentrism would have us think otherwise. But the reason that capitalists were able to, or why the capitalists wanted to use child labor is that, okay, well, children, they earn a lower wage, and women earn a lower wage. But why is that though? Is it just because capitalists hate women and children? Well, I mean, they might, but that's not actually the reason. The reason is that if there's only one breadwinner in the household and it's the man, then let's say that the family, in order to survive, requires $10 a day. If only the man is working, you have to pay him $10. But if the child and the woman are also working, you can pay the woman $3, pay the child $2, and then you can reduce the man's earnings to $5. It's still $10 in total. Back in the day, when it was mostly just men who were working, women's wages were not seen as like proper wages, because it was thought that, well, there's some guy who is like economically taking care of this woman anyway, so she doesn't actually need a livable wage. So that's why they were able to do that. The textbook also gives some interesting statistics. It says that the rise in the cost of living and the fall in the level of real wages connected with this are caused also by the rise in the price of mass consumer goods. Thus, in France, on account of inflation, retail prices of foodstuffs in 1938 were 7 times as high as in 1914. And then it says that a considerable part of the workers' wages is absorbed by rent. In Germany, between 1900 and 1930, the average rent grew by 70%. I wish I could find it. I remember there was this article that said that in Finland, I think in 3 generations, productivity increased by 7 times, and wages increased by 3 times, but rents also increased by 3 times. And I wish I could find that article. The textbook further says that in 1924, the real wages of the German workers were only 75% of what they had been in 1900, so that was already before the Great Depression. And then during the Great Depression, they fell to only 66% of what they had been in 1900. In Tsarist Russia, in 1913, real wages of industrial workers had fallen by not less than 90% than what they had been in 1900. The textbook further says that the value of labor power is not identical in all countries. The value of labor power consists of the commodities that it takes to maintain the worker. That changes historically, so living conditions of people have changed historically. Costs of training workers obviously depends on the historical era, depends on what kind of work it is they're doing. It depends on the price of consumer goods, etc. Price of consumer goods, of course, vary greatly between different countries. Imperialists, they super-exploit colonial and dependent countries. The textbook says that capital takes advantage of the great surplus of working hands available in those countries and pays for labor power at very much less than its value. In this connection, the worker's nationality is taken into account. So what that means is that in the colonies and dependent countries, let's say in British India or something, they think that they can pay the workers less than subsistence and just let them slowly starve or slowly become invalids, because they don't care. They think there's a lot of them. If that guy starves, it doesn't matter. There's more to replace him. And they do it based on nationality or race. So, for instance, the textbook says that in America, whites and blacks who perform the same work are paid different rates. I wouldn't be surprised if that still wasn't the case in the US. Obviously, nowadays it would be illegal, but I'm sure it still happens. It says that in South Africa, the average wage of black workers is only 1/10 of that of a white worker, and that in the US, black workers in the urban areas are paid only 2/5, and in the agricultural areas only 1/3 of what the whites are paid for the same work. These days, even though that kind of stuff obviously in most developed Western industrial countries these days is illegal, you are supposed to pay people roughly the same for the same kind of work. You are not allowed to discriminate. However, that's why they use migrants. They hire migrants. The same laws, the same contracts negotiated by the trade unions, they don't apply to migrants. They also don't apply to seasonal workers, etc., etc., so they can pay those people less. So in that sense, the same kind of thing is still going on to this day. In Finland, the capitalists use a lot of subcontractors. There's companies that specialize in bringing construction workers from Poland who work in Finland for a short period of time at very low wages, and then they are sent back or sent somewhere else. They use cleaners and bus drivers who come here from the Baltic states and etc. etc. So they still kind of do that kind of thing. And I would consider that it's not exactly colonial, but it is national oppression, and it is a kind of super-exploitation. It is more than the average level of exploitation. And of course, when we are talking about like blacks in the US, for instance, they are not a typical colony, because a colony is usually a foreign state or foreign territory that a country conquers and subjugates. But in the US, the African slaves that were brought to the US, they're not an external colony. The US didn't conquer Africa. Instead, they're an internal colony. The US literally just took the Africans and brought them inside the US. Kind of that kind of thing still going on with the migrant labor, that obviously Finland doesn't really have colonies or dependent countries, but they're bringing people from third world countries and poorer countries in general, even countries in Europe which are poorer than Finland, and they're using them as cheap migrant labor. But obviously, when it comes to the empirical reality, like if we are to believe those articles that I showed earlier saying that the Finnish living standard hasn't increased in 17 years, is that possible? Yeah, I think it's likely. Probably it hasn't, but the Finnish living standard still did increase within the last 100 years, let's say. Some people look at that and they claim, okay, that means that Marx is wrong. That means that there is no tendency for the wage to go down. Well, there's a minimum limit to the wages, so the wage always tends to go down towards the minimum limit, but it cannot go much lower than that. The minimum limit is that the workers have to survive. If the workers don't survive, the working class starts to die off and become incapacitated, well, then capitalism starts to break down. So there is a minimum limit. So between the maximum limit and the minimum limit, there's some negotiating room. The negotiation is basically, it's not about can the capitalist exploit the worker, because that's a given. That's default. The exploitation is part of the very fabric of capitalism. It cannot be done away with without doing away with capitalism itself. The negotiation is about how much does the capitalist exploit the worker. And the result is determined by basically the relation of class forces. So the capitalists, they endeavor to push wages down, and the workers, they try to unionize, go on strike and whatnot, try to negotiate higher wages. And of course, the workers in the last 100 years, they've been rather successful in that, at least in the West, and there's numerous reasons for that, mostly because of the militant labor movement and the rise of communism and Marxism, and the fact that the capitalists, they want to move production to cheaper countries, so they have to achieve a relative stability in the imperialist homelands, in the imperialist motherlands. So they try to kind of appease and make concessions to the workers in the Western countries. So the workers have been able to win higher wages. There's also been a lot of state intervention, so the state has started to use tax money to create social safety nets and those kinds of things, which have improved the conditions of the workers greatly. But it's not simple. It's not like the conditions have just got better and better. No, it seems that the wages of the workers were falling consistently until the Second World War. After the Second World War, there was a period in which the wages eventually started to go up, until there was the period of neoliberalism in the 70s and 80s. Then a lot of the production started being moved away from the Western countries and away from Europe and away from the US into third world countries, and that's kind of where we are today.